I'm Michael Bungay-Stanier, and this is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change. If you're a transformational leader and you're looking to see the future and be the future, well, this is the perfect podcast for you. We've heard about change. We've heard about change management. We've heard about transformation. We've heard about digital transformation. The whole language around this discipline keeps evolving, of course. But here's a new one for you: autonomous transformation. I mean, it's beyond digital transformation, but what is it? Well, here's a starter for 10 as a definition. It's not tweaking what's already there, it's fundamentally reimagining what the organization is transforming into using AI and automation to deliver new value to customers. As transformational leaders, we have all come to realize that this is the time of AI, and we probably need to understand it better than we do, because certainly for me at least, it does feel like the AI tail has started to wag the organizational dog. Luckily, I know a man who knows autonomous transformation. It's Brian Evergreen. He's a former executive at Microsoft and has written a book of the same name. So we are going to plunge into it. Brian, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, Michael.
You wrote Autonomous Transformation 3 years ago, kind of before us commoners really understood that AI was a thing and ChatGPT was a thing. And now we're all going, I've got this idea of the future coming at people. People are just kind of like batting away the anxiety and the stress and the speed. I was at a breakfast this morning with a group of change leaders, and one said, my boss has said we now need to move at the speed of light to manage it. I'm like, that is a high bar. You should step away from that. Let's start then, perhaps with going, all right, so if I'm not being just reactive to the way what was the future is now the present has showed up and started to slap me in the face a bit, how do I find the courage and the capacity to see a future that I might want to move towards?
So the first thing I'd share is there's this funny video that circulated the internet where there was this young boy, probably 4 years old or something, and he was in the water, like in the ocean, and he's sobbing because he's afraid that he's drowning. And his parent or sibling, there's someone older than him that sort of points out that, hey, you can just stand up. And then all of a sudden he stands up and he's completely relieved and he's like, oh, thank goodness, right?
Just to say, I have been that boy more times than I care to admit.
And I would say that for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed right now and with everything that, quote, is going on, aside from geopolitical stuff, which we have obviously much less control over for most of us.
Yeah.
But in terms of the corporate space and AI, you can just stand up. Right. And if you stand up and you move past all the noise, past all the announcements of, look, someone introduced 4.1, it's a new model.
Right.
It's easy because we see the news announcements every single day and there's something else that we feel like we have to catch up on. But if you didn't catch up on prompt engineering and you didn't catch up on vibe coding and you haven't caught up on, there's this pressure I think people feel that they have to know and understand all of these things in order to create value with them or in order to keep up.
Yeah.
When in fact, that's like a construction leader, like someone who works in the business of building buildings, saying, oh, there's this new blade that just came out from DeWalt and I have to try it. I have to watch the way that it cuts through the wood. This one actually spins at a higher speed than these other blades.
Right.
And so, right. But that's not what you need to know as someone in construction. Your craft is different than that. And so as a business person, your craft is different. Sure, there's people who are business people who are also data scientists, and then there's an overlap. But for the most people that I'm guessing that are listening in today, your craft is not to be an AI expert. Your craft is to be an expert in creating value for your customers and your organization and your ecosystem. And that's the thing you need to double down on in partnership with people that have expertise on AI, but not even necessarily AI.
But Brian, the challenge for a lot of people is they're like, if it was just down to me, yeah, of course I would stand up. But actually, my CEO, she's going, look, my competitors have an AI advantage. That's a strategic loss to us. We might be start losing market share. we need to be an AI first company now. So look, I mean, I can't do it myself, but I think everybody else should be learning AI. So, at the breakfast this morning, somebody was saying people are feeling like they got two jobs. They got their job and then they've got and I need to learn AI. And it's trickling down from the C-suite. That's just a reflection. I want to come back to this idea that if you are setting a goal to transform your organization,
Mm-hmm.
you are not going to just let the future come at you. You're going to make a decision and step into the future. Future solving, as your company's called and as one of your famous frameworks is known as. Teach me how to set a clear vision. How would you coach me on that?
I would start by saying we need to get out of your normal context because you're not going to be able to really have the right creative energy to set a vision for the future in an hour-long vision call sandwiched between other calls or other meetings.
Right.
So that's the first thing, is to actually curate the context. Then the second thing I would say is let's think through your core competencies. And there's a number of different methods you can use. Like you could, for instance, say, all right, let's imagine, like Bell Labs famously did, the president in 1952 pointed out that all their greatest inventions that they'd been recognized for had all been invented before any of his senior leaders had even been born, much less worked there, and that they were basically just incrementally improving on what had already been invented.
Right.
So what they did in that process is he actually said, and this is something that if I were teaching you, we could do this, is say, let's imagine that the value that your business creates is gone. Like it's been wiped out. And so in his case, he said the US telephone system is completely eliminated. We're starting from scratch with the current technologies, the current, political and regulatory and financial environment, and we're going to create the best version of what we can create now. In that case, they ended up creating, like in that 1 year, a string of inventions that took some of them decades, including the basis of cellular technologies and voicemail and IVR and all these different things, just that 1 year. So for you, what I'd say is if we imagine the business that you lead, if you imagine that was eliminated and you were starting from scratch, so that you're not starting from what you have and trying to make it better.
Right.
The value that I'm creating in the market that people are willing to pay for, with everything that I know now, all the relationships that I have, what would be the best version of that first?
Got it.
That's something, if we were actually workshopping this, I'd say, let's come up with a few ideas and write them down on sticky notes.
If you're able, you might want to grab pen and paper because Brian's about to do some minor facilitation with us. If you're on the move as you're listening to this, well, no problem. Just make a note of when it is during the pod and you can come back to it later with pen and paper.
And then once you came up with a few, then I would do a, fast one on you and show you, hey, here's something I call a 9-drint, where I draw a grid on the board of 9 squares.
3 by 3, right?
Yeah, 3 by 3. On the x-axis is achievable within my team, meaning I don't need anyone else's permission. I can just do this. And then to the middle of that is still on the x-axis, achievable within my organization with consensus. In other words, I'm going to need others in the organization to buy in and support me in this.
Yeah.
And then the far right of the x-axis is achievable in my industry with a coalition.
Okay.
And then on the y-axis, you have not ambitious enough on the bottom. And then the middle is bold and achievable. And then the top is too ambitious.
Got it.
So if it were just you and me, normally in a workshop setting, I have folks put their sticky notes up to show and tell, and we all learn from that process. And it's really interesting to see, all of our visions are things that would take an entire industry coalition and we think are too ambitious. It's no wonder we don't know where to start. Or everything we're thinking of is, based on things we can control. So we're on the far left of the x-axis, and so, it's no wonder that we're struggling to get bold, right?
So you're calibrating achievability and ambition and trying to find a sweet spot around that.
That's right. And then the next thing we would do is we would start solving for the future. And this has been the basis of so much of my work since even while I was at Microsoft, but especially since, which is then asking the question, well, what would have to be true? So often even if you do have a bold ambition or something like that, you're putting it at the top of the page. Let's say it's carbon neutrality. Then what you do is you then go out and you assess all the problems that you have. And you say, okay, how big are these problems? How much are they affecting? And how much would it cost to fix them? And you use an algebraic sort of approach to come up with, okay, these are the ones we're going to start knocking out. Or here's some steps we would do that would move us in the overall direction of our vision.
Yeah.
And so, then instead of doing that, and instead of problem solving, which is the craft of getting rid of what you don't want, future solving is the opposite, the craft of getting what you do want. And so saying, okay, if this is my vision, putting the vision at the top of the whiteboard, so to speak, and then asking yourself and your team what would have to be true, and then writing those down as, okay, these 7 things, if these 7 things were true, would we have achieved our ambition? If yes, great, let's move on. Now let's go to the next bubble of those 7 things for this one here. What would have to be true for this to be true?
Yeah.
And you could work your way down to the point where you've actually mapped the whole route and you can take the most direct path.
I first heard that question from Roger Martin. And what I love about it is that it moves you into the future and you work back from the future rather than has you in the present and you try and hack your way into the future from where you're standing right now. And I think it can be particularly powerful if you've got different options and then you go, what needs to be true against these different options? And it just becomes a more interesting conversation than, is this a good idea or not? Because everybody has an opinion. But what needs to be true is a way of kind of testing with imagination and capacity around how we might pull this off or not.
Well, exactly. And it also helps you to see, so often from a systems thinking perspective, people see pieces on the board, so to speak. I make a lot of chess analogies, but they see pieces on the board as fixed when in fact they might not be.
My favorite story of this is if you ever visit Australia as a tourist, one of the things you can do is walk to the top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And it's a great thing to do. I've done it a couple of times. It's a great adventure. You get this amazing view over the harbour, the Sydney Opera House. It's a beautiful city. And the guy who owns that business, when he first came up with it, the Sydney City Council or whoever it was said, look, here are 180 reasons why we are never going to say yes to this. But he took that not as here's your list of what you can't do. He took it as this is what needs to be true for this to do. And he just systematically worked through all of these objections and came back and went, done. And they're like, okay, well then, and now he's a gazillionaire, I would guess, because, he puts a lot of people up and down that bridge. Brian, you talked about the chess analogy and, people seeing pieces, but not really seeing the board. And I think one of the skills you talk about is this idea of being able to see the system. How do we get better at that? System thinking, everybody says it, everybody nods their head going, yeah, that's good, but it's hard. And I don't know how you build that capacity in people.
Yeah, so for me, it was baked into the way that I thought at a very early age because of chess. I was an internationally competitive chess player, which is why I still use a lot of chess analogies. And so to your point of, if there's something valuable about the way that I'm seeing things, how do I teach other people to do that? And so one thing that I've found is, I think, helpful to zoom out and see the whole board is this idea of synthesis. In the book, I call it the lost art of synthesis. And when we hear synthesis, most people think bringing things together, right? Like combining different things. And that's a definition of synthesis. But the systems thinking movement codified analysis and synthesis at the same time. And so if you take any object, like let's say a university like Stanford, and you say, how well is Stanford doing at its job, so to speak? What would be the things that come to mind right now? Almost always it's something like, well, how many students are there? How many graduates? How many departments? How many professors? How many research papers are being published? And et cetera, et cetera. And then what I usually then do is say, okay, so these are all questions that fall into the analysis bucket. Analysis being that you take a subject like Stanford and you break it into smaller pieces, and then you try to understand each piece taken separately, and then aggregate the understanding of all those individual pieces back into an understanding of the whole. This is something toddlers do. We do it very intuitively at people, right? What happens though is that process is valuable. It gives us knowledge of how something works, but it does not give us understanding of why it exists. So if we're looking at how many grads, doesn't, this other university over here have more grads? So are they better than Stanford?
Right.
Does this other one put out more papers? Does that make them better? Stanford has a lot of dropouts. Is that a bad thing? So synthesis is the opposite of that, where instead of taking the subject like Stanford and breaking it into smaller parts, you say Stanford is a part of bigger systems. And then what you do is you say, what do those bigger systems need from Stanford? And it's like, well, the economic system might need graduates who are immediately ready to produce economic value
Right.
through creating their own businesses or joining and contributing to other businesses. Okay, well, then that's a very different question than how many grads are coming out. Or that's a different question than how many drop out and do startups. And then whereas the academic system needs a university to be continuing to advance the knowledge in a given field of research,
Yeah.
which also has nothing to do with the number of grads or whether or not those people can produce economic value. So understanding the bigger systems gives you better understanding of why it exists. Then you can have a more meaningful conversation.
I'm just curious to know where the systems thinking can live in an organization. If I'm a change leader and I'm trying to lead change in an organization, and my CEO has said, we need this to be different. We need to kind of figure out how to do this differently. Where's the moment for me to incorporate this thinking? Because as soon as I start going big thinking and connections,
Right.
don't I just irritate my CEO who's like, I kind of told you what we're doing here. And now you're like, but what does real success look like? What's the real job that needs to be done? What's the innovator's dilemma that we're trying to overcome here?
Right.
So how does this fit in the everyday life of a change leader?
The first thing to reflexively ask before I answer your question, you're saying if the CEO says, hey, we need to come up with a strategy for AI, for example.
Yeah, so let's say that, which is like, we need to become a more AI-based company because everybody else is in my industry. And I'm feeling a bit anxious about it and I don't want to lose ground to my competitive things. So it's like, help me transform my company so that we become AI enabled.
Okay. So what I would say then, first of all, when companies say they need to be AI first, that's a bit like saying you need to be hammer first. Like there has to be a vision. And so the idea of being AI first or AI enabled or AI whatever is there's some flawed thinking that is because of the market dynamic and what's being put out there, and then people making these bold declarations where they feel like they're being smart because they're saying this.
Okay, but if I'm the CEO, I've got a vision for what I'm trying to build with my company.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and we were hoping to get there in 3 years. And I'm now thinking 2 years. There's a bigger strategic vision, but you know what? We need to transform this company to build it faster and better because we've got AI now as a super saw to help build this stuff faster.
So in that case, I would say, just like you shouldn't start with AI, you also shouldn't necessarily start with systems thinking. System thinking can be helpful for understanding the context and the lay of the land.
Got it.
But the actual exercise that I would recommend is if that CEO has a clearly articulated vision of something they've been wanting to achieve, then I would set aside everything else, put the vision at the top of your paper or your whiteboard, and ask what would have to be true for us to reach this vision.
You'll find Brian Evergreen on LinkedIn, and he also writes a weekly blog/newsletter. That's at brians.blog, brians.blog. It's actually a Substack. His book is Autonomous Transformation, Creating a More Human Future in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. And actually, if you're enjoying this conversation, you might want to go back and pair it up with Kate O'Neill's from a couple of weeks ago, because it explores similar terrain. Now, Brian, your book is called Autonomous Transformation, but we haven't actually taken the time to define what that is. We've heard of change, we've heard of transformation, we've heard of digital transformation. I'm going to guess fewer people have heard of autonomous transformation. It sounds a little bit like it's AI taking over everything, but I suspect that's not actually what you mean. How do you define autonomous transformation?
Yeah, so the easiest way, instead of giving a technical definition, I'll just say the same way that we were going from analog to digital, and we called that digital transformation.
Right.
We're going from digital and or analog, because sometimes we haven't gone to digital, but we're jumping toward autonomy. And not to say that we all have autonomous enterprises, nor to say that all work will be autonomous, but instead to say the same way that digital capabilities transform how we work and the value we create, so too will autonomous capabilities. So as an example, today, if you had a disaster scenario in a developing country and there's medicine that needs to get there, An autonomous transformation sort of version of that would be where the moment that it happens, there's a sort of a signal that happens inside the organization.
Yeah.
Someone is sent a list of actions to approve, a human at the helm, so to speak. They approve it. And then from then, the medicine is automatically pulled together by various machinery and or people. It could still be people in different points.
Yeah.
And then at the point where it hits that drone and it's inside the drones could then autonomously find their own charging stations along the way, or even make microtransactions with planes and say, we'll get there faster if we fly on a plane. There's already a plane leaving. It already has space at its cargo bay. And you have this internet of agents, so to speak, that are able to interface and create value for us as people. And you can think about how that would scale across industries.
All right. So I understand that as a kind of a strategic goal, which is I'm trying to build that in. If I'm now trying to make my organization capable of that, am I able just to take some of the templates and playbooks from past approaches to change and overlay it on my organization? He says, setting you up to say no.
I was going to say, that's a softball. My first role at Microsoft was USAI strategy lead, and I was tasked to meet with them to discuss, this is in 2019, how are we going to use AI to sort of reinvent our market or to reinvent what we do or what have you? And my assumption when I was given that charter was, I'm going to borrow from, because I was ex-Accenture, I spent a number of years in consulting. So I was like, I'm going to find the frameworks that already exist and I'm going to use them.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, I quickly learned, okay, the digital transformation playbook, it worked because we were using the inheritance from the Industrial Revolution, which is an incrementalism mindset. And that worked in digital transformation because incrementally improving something from analog to digital can actually be a 10x of value, overnight, because it's so much better when it's digital than when it's analog in so many cases.
And that said, I've seen research from Bain that says 95% of digital transformations fail. So they're not working that well.
Right. Well, right. Sure. The question I would put to that is what's falling under the bucket of digital transformation? Because what I would say true digital transformation is we had something analog, now it's digital. Whereas I would say AI wrongly got put under the digital transformation umbrella. That's why I created autonomous transformation as a category, was to say, this is a new conversation. If you're trying to approach it the same way as digital transformation, you're resigning from the first move. It's not going to work.
That's a chess analogy again.
Yeah.
So if I had to know 3 things that need to be different for autonomous transformation, what are the 3 things?
So thing number 1 is that it has to start with vision.
Okay.
You have to have a vision that's clearly articulated for the value that you're going to create in the market that's different than what you've been creating now.
Okay.
The second thing I would say is that your strategy needs to be visible. So most strategies in organizations today are sort of buried between PowerPoint decks, and the levels of abstraction they're relying on verbal communication to be able to articulate that. The strategy has to be visible. People in one page, they should be able to see, these are all the things that would have to be true for us to reach this.
Yeah.
And number 3, what I would say, there's never been a more important time to acknowledge and focus on the fact that work is human and learning is human. And so when you want to get something done in an organization, yes, there's the technical components. Yes, there's the business side of the finance and the modeling and all that. And then there's also a body of people. Like this happened to me at one point when I entered a new organization. I knew what needed to be done. I had the vision. I developed a strategy. I was brand new to the organization, so I had no social capital to get people on board. And so the social economics and understanding influence and storytelling and all of that as the underpin of change is critical, but often underestimated or passed over. So those would be the 3: is to start with vision, make your strategy visible, and then become a master at social economics.
I think those 3 elements from Brian actually feel deeply helpful for all versions of change, autonomous and otherwise. You need a vision, you need a visible strategy, and you need to stay people-focused. It's a pretty nice place to wrap up. Thanks for your support with this podcast. Anything you do to help it get known is helpful, particularly if you recommend an episode you love to a colleague you like. Thank you in advance for that. There's more at thechangesignal.com. Thanks for doing the work. I'm glad you're here.